It's brought to you by our local ISD chapter. And if you're not a member of the local ISD chapter, I really encourage you to become a member. You know, it's really cool stuff. All right, so our next session is going to be, I think it's going to be really fun, you know, really cool stuff. And so our next presenter is going to be Chris Teodorski. And so let me just talk about Chris for a second before he comes up here, and we're just going to talk about him as if he's not here. So Chris is a principal security analyst with EMC Rubicon Cloud team. He holds a master's degree in information security and assurance, and does information security both as a hobby and a career. Chris still spends way too much time on IRC and finds childishly inappropriate jokes way too funny. He's a dad of, I love this part, man, 2 amazing daughters, and I'm sure you're an amazing father.
I try to be.
All right, cool. I'm a husband and a full-time geek. Pretty much like all of us here. Well, except me. I'm the guy looking inside. And much to his wife's great disappointment, all of us, he dreams of someday mastering the banjo and singing country songs.
Sad country songs.
Sad country songs. Kind of goes along with information security. All right, cool. The title of Chris's presentation is Kippo in Bits, and he will discuss SSH honeypotting activities. Chris company's
EMC.com. EMC.com, you can find my company.
Thank you, Chris.
Yep, no problem.
EMC.com, you can find Chris there. And you can also follow Chris on Twitter. His handle is CAN0BEANS. That can
of beans.
Can of beans. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Chris Teodorski.
Cool, thank you very much. All right, so he pretty much covered everything about me. The one thing I would say, and I've heard a couple people mention it, like I said, all that was kind of in the introduction, but I want to put a plug in for the OSCP. If any of you guys are interested in pen testing, it is hands down the best certification that I've ever done, and you will learn a lot. I went into it very cocky, thinking that this pen testing stuff, I got this figured out. And you get lab time, and I kept having to go back to my boss and saying, can I get more lab time? Because it's really hard, but I just want to put the plug in there because it's really, really a good certification. And also, as was mentioned, I work for EMC's Rubicon, which is their cloud services division. It's fairly new for EMC. They acquired a bunch of cloud companies and kind of slammed them all together under Rubicon, and we are hiring. So it is a 100% work from home gig for the positions that we have, and we're looking for security operations folks, security architects. So shoot me an email. I can give you my email address if anybody wants it. Like I said, send me resumes. You know, we are definitely looking for folks. So that's enough about me. Let's move on. So let's talk about what a honeypot is. Now, I assume you all know what a honeypot is, but let's just put out a formal definition as a security resource whose value lies solely in being probed, attacked, or compromised. Hopefully that sets it apart from the other resources on your network, but that's its sole purpose, is to be compromised and attacked. And I would break honeypots down into 2 major categories. You have your analysis honeypots, like HoneyD, the HoneyNet project, and then you have your delay honeypots, which basically are just like the La Brea tar pit. I don't know if any of you guys remember that project. That goes way back. But that was basically to slow down port scanners, right? When it got hit by a port scanner, it would just tangle the port scanner up so that it would tie it up. So that's kind of how I would split the two types of honeypots. And when I was setting up to do this talk, I started to do a lot of research around honeypots. And first of all, the first reference to a honeypot, I'll put a little plug in here, the first reference in print to the idea of a honeypot was Cliff Stoll's book, The Cuckoo's Egg. And that was in 1989. If you haven't read that book, it's a really good read, very interesting. He set up what he called SDI-net at the Lawrence Berkeley Labs specifically to lure an attacker in, to watch what they were doing and to kind of infiltrate the attackers group. And that was the first time it was mentioned in print. In the early 2000s, if you go back and start cruising the internet looking for honeypot information, you'll find that in early 2000, it was a really hot idea. Like lots of companies were marketing honeypots. Symantec was selling Mantrap. There was a product called Spectre, NetBait, KF Sensor. There were all kinds of products in the early 2000s that were doing honeypot stuff. And then they just kind of disappear after that. Now, when I was researching, I found this, and I was pretty excited. This is the Patriot box, and I found this, and it's only $39.99, and it baits hackers away from your corporate network. And then I found that it actually hasn't been developed in a long time, and it's not really a product. I mean, maybe you can buy it. I don't know. But the more I started looking at it, I was like, Jesus, I don't know about this whole thing. And I thought, geez, maybe it looks like something written by this guy. And I don't know how many of you know who the world's #1 hacker is, but it does look like something he might be involved in. So when we talk about honeypots, and like I said, the question was, why did they go away, right? Why was there so much commercial interest in it, and then all of a sudden, poof, it kind of went away? And I put the question out to Twitter at one point, because I was just curious to say, what was people's idea? Why did they think it went away? And Nick Harbour responded very harshly with, maybe because it's a waste of time and never improved security. And as somebody who was really into honeypots, that honestly hurt my heart a little bit. Because he's like, it's a total waste of time. Why would you do that? And I think probably it lost its momentum because it's one of those tools that's hard to get interesting data out of. I think there's work involved. It's not a click, pretty dashboard tool. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the honeypot kind of went away as a commercial product. However, in 2011, Symantec announced that they were going to start selling their honeypot because, of course, the AV companies run their own honeypots. And Symantec said, we're going to start selling this again, but only to select customers. So they were specifically targeting the government in particular, that they were going to start offering this as a product again. So, maybe they're going to make a comeback again, but I don't think so, as a product anyways. But let's talk about what I think a honeypot does. Like I said, Nick Harbour said, total waste of time. Lenny Zeltser has this quote pretty much. Like I said, it's paraphrased slightly, but this is basically from his website. And I think this is really what the value of a honeypot is it can just, and the key is in the beginning. They can strengthen the defense posture of a mature enterprise. So obviously a honeypot is not the first tool that you should be deploying on your network. Not second, not third, not even fourth. It's for a mature enterprise, and it can give you insight into what's going on. So it decreases the rate of false positive, capturing malware samples, and gives you an idea of the intruder's intentions. So again, for a mature enterprise, I think that's the key. And I also don't want to pretend that it's any panacea. Obviously, if you have compliance requirements and you put an intentionally vulnerable box on your network, it might be a little hard to explain to your auditor the honeypot in your CDE. And so, it might not be the right tool for everyone. And I get that. But for me, it's a really fun Friday night. So now now that we've covered that, let's talk a little bit about Kippo. So Kippo is probably the best known SSH honeypot, and it is a medium interaction SSH honeypot. And by medium interaction, the differentiation would be, a low interaction would be one that maybe just mimics a port, for example. So it looks like a service, right? You can't actually interact with the service. It just tricks a scanner into thinking that it's a service. So it's a low interaction. In medium interaction, you can actually log in and interact with it, right? As opposed to let's say a high interaction where you can actually really do stuff. So what Kippo does is actually just mimics the SSH shell, right? The bash shell. It's a piece of cake to install. That's basically all it takes. Like I said, really easy to install. This was actually the next screen. This is what I did to get it up and running on Ubuntu. So, I mean, seriously, piece of cake. So you download it, you extract it, and you go. Sort of. So there is a config file. You want to make some changes. You set the SSH port, set the host name. Now remember, I said it mimics the SSH shell. Excuse me. So you'll want to set a host name, and that is the host name that will appear inside the pretend SSH shell. And then it has a file where you set the users and the passwords. Obviously, you want those users and passwords to be easily guessable because you want the bad guys to get in, right? That's the point. You want them to get in and see what you're doing. So obviously, you would not want to run Kippo as root. Now, you would also have to work really hard to do this because Kippo is very smart, and if you try to run Kippo as root, it says, you're an idiot, stop it, and exits out. But I just thought I'd put that out there. This is not something you'd want to run as root. Now, people, they are running in a imitation shell, but of course, if they were able to escape out of Kippo, then they would be running as root on your real system. So what you'll want to do, because you're not running as root, so you're not going to be able to open port 22 to listen on, is you can either do it with IP tables, which is what I did. So I just redirected incoming traffic on 22 to the port that Kippo was listening on, or you can use authbind. Authbind makes it a little bit easier than IP tables does, but however you want to do it. So once you get this all set up, you sit back and wait. And you will get compromised. Again, assuming your password is reasonably easy, you will get compromised. And what Kippo does is, Kippo has two directories. So you'll find a DL directory, a log directory, and a TTY directory underneath the log directory. Now, the DL directory, what you'll find is that when a bad guy connects to your system, they will often download their toolset. They will also download other things to get an idea of what kind of bandwidth they have access to. So one of the things that they would do over and over again is download service packs from Microsoft, which is kind of funny because you're sitting on a Linux box and you're seeing all these Microsoft service packs coming in. But then what you get in your log directory is where I think the real coolness of Kippo is. You get actually what I would call, and this is starting to date me already, you'll get VCR-like playback. Right? I don't know what the modern analogy, I don't even know what I would say for that, but you get VCR-like playback of the logs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate for you guys, I'm going to show you an actual demo of an attacker connected to one of my systems. Okay, and you'll get an idea, a real sense of how this whole Kippo thing works. And that, of course, is the live demo god that everyone must worship because... Okay, so what I'm going to do is, can everybody see that? Is the text large enough? Okay, so I'm going to replay a session. And like I said, this is actually an actual attacker logged into one of my boxes. And I called it SSL web server. And as you can see, this is the attacker actually typing. It records everything they do. So they're going to go through and they're going to, start to hide themselves, essentially. And then they're going to gather information about the host. And they're going to reset the password. In some cases, they did it. Some cases, they didn't. It wasn't always 100% true that they would change the password. So they're looking at processes. They're just kind of feeling their way around the system. And this is where they download their tool set. And like I said, Kippo will mimic this. So Kippo will allow them to download their tool set so they They think that it's really coming down, so they get their tools. And this is how you know that this is a person, not a script, because there's a typo and they're going back and correcting it. So they're now trying to run their tool and it's not working. And if you remember, like I said, Kippo is not a real shell, right? It's mimicking a shell. So some of their stuff is not going to work. A lot of their stuff that they're trying to execute is not going to work. So this is obviously an attacker who's a little confused at this point. Because they're trying to check where they are and why stuff isn't working. So again, I mean, they're running to and really trying to interrogate this box and trying to figure out why that tool set didn't work right now. Okay, so now they've exited, and this is the great thing about Kippo. So they press exit, and now you see the host. The name says localhost, but they're still actually inside Kippo. Okay, so it won't actually let them exit. So now they're trying to run nmap from their machine, and they're confused as to why it's not running, but they're actually still connected to Kippo. So again, they're running through the commands, and then I believe they hit exit. Oh, so he's checking the IP now, because now he's confused as to why his tool isn't working. So then he closes again, still inside Kippo. So again, he's trying to exit, still inside Kippo. Okay, so that's it. So he actually closed the session at that point. All right. So after running this honeypot for months, I collected all this data and I ran in disparate locations, geographies, and here's what I thought I had learned. And I thought I had learned that they were smarter than I initially thought. And I say that despite how funny that video was, what I found was that they were very good at detecting it was a Kippo box. Kippo out of the box looks like a Kippo box. There's things you can do. You can make changes to the file system to kind of fake it out. But they were pretty good at detecting that it was not real and bailing. And I also thought that they were Chinese. Because if you look, this is an example from something I've done recently. The majority of my attacks were coming out of Asia. I mean, far and away, the majority of them were coming out of Asia. So I thought, okay, this is... Honestly, in some ways, I was kind of disappointed with that because I thought, well, this is kind of what I expected, right? This is not, okay, so the Chinese are looking for SSH hosts. That's just not really that interesting to me. So I was like, okay. So what I've done is, I've now run a bunch of Kippo boxes. I've seen my box get compromised. I've watched them use their tools. But how can I take this a little further, right? I didn't kind of want to stop there because, like I said, they were limited. They couldn't actually run their tools. So I wanted to know what it looked like more if they were allowed to do what they wanted to do. So I'm going to put my little disclaimer out here. I have a really good friend back in Pittsburgh who's an attorney who gets very nervous about some of the stuff that I do. And so he said, you need to really put a disclaimer on your talk about what you did. So here's my disclaimer. What I did could end up with you getting a nice pair of those, potentially. Potentially. It could get you some of that. But probably it's going to end up more like this, because you're going to violate the terms of service that you signed with your ISP in the way that I did my particular research. So here's what I did with my network. So this is my home network. That's my external firewall. This is where I keep my porn. And then this is a pfSense box. And this is all running in a virtual environment. Okay? So I have a Linux box with a horrible root password, a snort box, which I ended up not even using. I really don't know why I stood that up. And then I had a Linux client machine. And I'll explain the Linux client machine in a second. Well, I'll talk about it right now. So one of the things that I used was the ability, essentially, of snapshotting, right, from VMware, so that I could I could let them compromise the box, they could do whatever they want with it, and then I could just roll it back to a pristine state and start over again, right? But when I did that, I would lose all my research data, anything that they had dropped on the box. So the Linux client machine was basically the point where I would bring it online, I would move the data, shut it back down, and then reboot that box and get back to a pristine state. So I did this all on my home network. So I was essentially advertising SSH to this Linux box. And now in this case, it's a real Linux box. It's not a Kippo box. And what I did was I used sudo sh, which is a shell that gives you the same kind of VCR-like playback that Kippo gives you, but again, from the real bash shell. I masked it as KSH. I literally, because I didn't want anybody to look and say, oh, my shell is sudo sh, someone's watching me. So I just called it KSH, corn shell. But it was clearly not corn shell. I mean, sudo sh basically is bash. And so it was clearly not corn shell. But again, I thought, I'm not really going to great efforts to hide this. As I said, I didn't try to be secretive. The other thing I did, and this is out on GitHub, and you're welcome to use it, I changed a little bit in the SSH binary and then recompiled the SSH binary to capture passwords. Because one of the things Kippo does that I wouldn't get from this was I wouldn't get a collection of the username and passwords that they tried to log in with as they were brute forcing, because SSH would hide all that. So obviously, don't use this on a production box because it writes the username and password in clear text to a log file that's really easy to find. And again, I'm sure this could be done more elegantly. I'm not a C programmer, but this got it done. So this is an example of what that log file looks like. So you get your username, in this case root, the password they were trying, and then the IP that they were coming from. So again, perfectly fine for my uses. So I set this all up, and then I waited. The other bit that I should have mentioned, and I'll get to it, I'll talk about it a little bit more, that pfSense box was also blocking outbound traffic to a certain extent. So for example, I was pretty confident that once they owned my box, that they were going to try to use it to send spam. Right? So I blocked outbound 25 because I thought, well, that's pretty obvious. The other thing I knew that they did was I knew they were scanning for SSH. So I blocked outbound 22 so that if they tried to scan other hosts from my machine, they wouldn't be able to do that. But obviously I allowed outbound HTTP so they could get their tools, HTTPS, things like that. So it was a fairly permissive rule set, but there were certain things that I blocked. So of course, the box was owned over and over again. It was almost always the same malware. It was almost always in the same place. But this time, because I had pfSense sitting there, I had a little more information. Because the other thing that I could do with pfSense is I could run a packet capture constantly. So any traffic going in and out, I could see. So, but before we get into that, I'll show you a quick demo of sudo sh. It's not going to look strikingly different from what you saw in Kippo. But again, so this box, it's running real fast. So I called this box Phoenix because I would burn it and bring it back up. And again, this is an actual attacker downloading their files. And again, in this case, their shit would work, right? Because it was a real Linux box. So again, he's just gathering all his tool sets. Yeah, we'll move on. Like I said, just to give you the idea, you get the same kind of thing with sudo sh that you get with Kippo, that playback. So let's talk a little bit about the interesting stuff now. Oh, no. Oh, okay, all right. Well, it gets better from here. Stop that. If I can figure out how this works, we'll be in good shape. There we go. Okay, so here's what after letting this run for a while, like I said, I would grab the tools, I'd grab the logs, I'd reset. What I found was a lot of IRC MechBot for command and control. So they were using that to connect to IRC to control the boxes that they owned. And then they would get PS scan, which is what they used to scan for more vulnerable hosts. A lot of times there was a different denial of service tool. I would find those pretty commonly on there. And then there would be user password lists, because that's what they were working from. Now, what's interesting to me is, so I gathered all these user and password lists on the host every time they would drop them. And often there would be multiple copies and different versions of it. And for an example, one of them had 137,776 unique combinations. That's a little good. And then I uniqued their file, and there were actually only 5,315 unique entries. There were tons of duplicates. And I thought, wow, this is weird. Like, what are these guys doing? They're wasting all this time. But like I said, I had the pfSense doing a constant packet capture. And this is an example. So like I said, I blocked SSH, right? So this is their SYN going out, and I just black holed it. So they would get no response from it. Come on. So again, this is another example. So what I said was I didn't block everything going out. And what I found was my machine was being used in attacks against other people, of course. So what you have right here is a denial of service attack that they were using my machine to blast somebody with UDP packets. I probably should have thought that through a little better, but you know, whatever. It's all for research, right? So the other thing that I saw was the IRC traffic that they were using for command and control. So I was looking at this and I was thinking, So as you can see there, I don't know if you guys can see it all. I know it's small. There's the channel. The channel appears in the traffic that they're joining, right? So they're connecting and joining the channel. And then, you know, I looked through it a little bit more, and I saw they were connecting to Undernet, and they were connecting regularly to this channel Piccolo, P-I-C-O-L-L-O. So I was like, what can I do with this information? And then I typed Piccolo into Google, and it said, do you mean Piccolo? Which I don't even know. I guess this is a Dragon Ball Z character. I don't really know much about it. But so I was like, okay, so this is my cover now. And again, very thinly veiled. I'm like, this is my cover. So I joined their IRC channel, and I said, I claimed that I was a 13-year-old kid who was interested in Dragon Ball Z. So again, that was my cover. I joined the channel. I have changed all of the IRC handles in here, and I'll talk about that also in a little bit, why I did that. But this is an example of what you would see in the channel. So for example, this Sinzati would say A, and then all the bots would respond with A, right? So he knew that he had his command and control working, so he could issue commands and they would respond. So I decided that it was easy to tell who the real person was versus who are the bots. So I said, okay, we're going to become the best of friends, right? I mean, I'm in the IRC channel. I got to talk to this person. So this is a conversation. My name was Fava Bean, which again, thinly veiled can of beans in the IRC handle, Fava Bean. Like I wasn't doing too much to conceal who I was. But so I came in and said question mark, and he said question mark, and then I said say A, right? Because I had seen him say A, and then I said, how come it doesn't work for me? And then I started with the whole Dragon Ball Z thing. I'm like, I'm a big fan of Dragon Ball. I'm 16 years old. I asked him how old he was. He said 24. And I said, not too old for Dragon Ball, huh? And he said, I've seen cartoons once. And I said, only once? And I said, I thought this was a channel for Dragon Ball. And he said, everything we have seen evenings we have seen, and his English was a little broken. And I asked him if he was in Japan or in the U.S. Again, I'm just trying to be friendly with him and see what he would say. And he says he's in Europa. And I was like, well, wait a second. I had seen all these attacks come up from China. So this guy's in Europa. That's kind of confusing. Oh. So what I found out was I wasn't dealing with APT. I was dealing with RPT, or the Romanian persistent threat. So what I found out was, as people would join the channel, there would be chatter in a language that I wasn't familiar with. So of course, Google Translate is beautiful at that. You put the language, you don't even know what it is, and it says, oh, I think this is Romanian. Would you like me to translate it into English? And I'm like, awesome. So I would sit there, and I would have one window up with the IRC chat, and one window up with Translate, and I'd copy and paste, so I could kind of understand what was going on. Now, in a lot of cases, Google Translate couldn't handle it. I'm assuming it was slang. I imagine if you took my IRC conversations and tried to translate them in another language, it would go the same way. But so here's another conversation where Sinzati at first thinks I'm a bot. Right? So when I come in, he issues a command for me to change my nick, and I just repeat it back to him. And then I said, why am I saying these things? And he smiled. And I said, why are you guys doing with all this stuff? I see you do it all the time. Now, they would issue commands to scan from inside IRC. So they would command their bot to scan. And what you see is I said, what does bang SSH IP port do? And he says, well, it pings the server. And I said, but why are so many servers being pinged? And I said, Ragundi, who is another user, does it all the time, server after server. And he said, excuse me a little, and then he went away. I don't know if I pushed him too far, I don't know if I engaged him too much, but he went away. And I said, tell me what it does, I want to learn. And that was it. So another gentleman joined the channel. Again, I assume gentlemen. I guess there's no reason for me to assume that. But I started asking questions again. And again, in English, we had this conversation, and I thought, okay, I'm going to really work this guy a little. I'm going to tell him about how I'm so curious. Again, my cover is that I'm a 16-year-old kid, right? So I'm so interested in Romania. We spent a lot of time, me asking questions about Romania, tell me about Romania. And, he said he's Romanian, and I said, oh, wow, Romania was a kingdom. And he said, it's a country, very nice people, they're smart. And so we had a conversation again. I asked how old he was. We just had this good rapport. And I asked him, I said, do you work or go to school? And he just flat out said, I'm stealing. I mean, if you look, he just flat out says, I'm stealing in other countries. And I said, what? And he said, to survive. And I said, I don't understand. And I said, what do you mean you're stealing? And he said, all steal. So there was not even an attempt to cover up what he was doing. Now, it turns out that there is honor amongst thieves. They would refer to a compromised host as a root. So when they would talk back and forth, they would say, I have 5 roots, I got 6 roots. That was kind of their term. And so this is when, like I said, change the names. I'll call him Raluca, came on. So one of the things I said was, I kept telling them that, again, I'm very interested in what they're doing. So I said, hey, how do I get a root? How do I do what you guys are doing? I completely dropped the Dragon Ball Z thing because it obviously didn't play well with my audience. They had no idea what I was talking about. So I just completely dropped that. And I started saying, hey, I want to learn what you guys do. And in the channel, someone said, hey, I will sell you a root. And I said, okay, how much is a root going to cost? And he said, I'll sell you one for $1. And I was like, okay, that's cool. And all of a sudden, I got a private message from Raluca. And this is the transcript of the private message. And what's interesting is, Raluca is trying to protect me and stop me from buying this $1 root. He says, don't send him money. He says they're shit. He'll give you root. The next day, you won't have it. He takes it back. And so I said, well, how much would a good root cost? And he said, 10 to 20 bucks for a good root. And he said, $1 roots are shit. And I said, is that 10 or 20 US or euro? And he said, that's 20 euro. So then I talked about buying one. And again, what amazed me is that this guy was really trying to protect me. Because I said, is it a bad idea to use my mom's PayPal? He said to me, you must ask her. He told me I had to ask my mom before I used her PayPal to buy a stolen route. And I said, I'll tell her I'm buying Dragon Ball stuff from eBay. And then he explains that he's scanning. And then he says, that he's scanning 3,500 IPs. And he said his ratio from 3,500 IPs is 10 to 20 routes, which kind of blew my mind. So we'll get to that. So he says, as you see, he says 10 routes by 20, $200. And I said, that's a lot of money. And he says, but I also could get 0 and no money. He said, it depends. And then he says, his scan is completed. So this guy was really friendly. He was really willing to talk. As a matter of fact, he was willing to tell me exactly where he lived. So he explains that I asked what town he was from, and he told me where it was. And he tells me what street he lives on. He says if you go to Google and zoom on that decibel street, you'll see it. That's his street. And I was thinking, wow, this guy really trusts me. And there's his street, in case anybody's interested. So that's the town and the street that he claimed he lived on. Now, I don't have any reason not to believe this guy because he was, like I said, seemed like he was actually trying to protect me. So again, I pumped him for information, and I said, what the tool that you use for root, can I download it? And the other interesting thing is, he says that he brute forces, it scans IPs, it brute forces, it tries, 1,000, 2,000 user password to an IP. If it matches, bingo, $20. And I said, do you ever get in trouble? And he said, I'm a minor. I'm not 18 years old. On 18 years, I quit. I can be in prison for this. Now, what's funny about that is, I asked him, I said, don't you guys have like juvie there? And he's like, what's that? And as I wrote it, I'm like, it's a prison for kids. And then I was like, oh, that sounds terrible. Like when I actually say it out loud. And he was like, I don't know what you're talking about. So he said, he could go to prison when he turned 18, so he was planning on giving it up. And I said, so you guys get all these routes, what do you do with them? And he said, we scan, we flood, we spam, we make money. But to your question, nobody would tell me who they would sell them to. And I might even have a slide on that in the deck later. But I would ask repeatedly, well, who do you sell them to? And the answer always from Raluca was, people like you, ha ha ha. That was the only answer I'd get out of him. So I don't really know who their target audience was, but that was the best answer. Now, this is interesting because I thought that these guys were... This was their thing. They were SSH scanning. They were, my assumption was that they were getting these boxes and then selling them to be used for spam, and then they get thrown away as they get blacklisted and they move on. I've changed a bunch of the data here, but this appears to be, this was copy and pasted into the channel. I believe this was a copy-paste mistake. This is somebody forgot they had this in their clipboard. But if you see, and like I said, I blacked a lot of this out. This was somebody's identity, their entire identity. And at first I was like, I don't know if I believe this. This is real data. But what really struck me was their date of birth is 1955, and their ATM pin is listed as 1955. And I was like, that's probably real. So it was at that point that I thought, I don't really know who I'm interacting with here, which is one of the reasons that I changed everyone's IRC handles and kind of masked that because, for all I know, someone asked me when I gave this talk before, is there a possibility that these people are doing this under duress? And I said, well, I honestly don't know. And then I started thinking about poor Raluca, and I thought, boy, I would feel real bad if somebody saw this presentation on the internet and then Raluca went and disappeared because he was spilling the beans to me. So that's one of the reasons that I changed the names, and like I said, I was kind of cowboying through all of this as I was going through. And then for some reason, when that identity got dumped to IRC, it's when I thought, well, geez, I don't really know who I'm interacting with, right? I mean, it could be organized crime for all I know. I have no idea. And like I said, that was the moment when it kind of hit me, and I was like, wow, this is Like this could be potentially really bad stuff. Again, I was doing some stuff to obscure who I was and where I was coming from, but because I didn't understand the skill level of the people that I was interacting with, at the time I was in Pittsburgh, and so I would tell people that I was from Pittsburgh because I thought if they looked up my IP to see where it was geographically, I wanted it to match, right? So I was giving a little bit of information about who I was, and I think probably somebody could have, unwound it if they wanted to. But so that was kind of my experience of walking through, the dark side of SSH honeypotting. So the question is, what does it all mean, right? So I've told you about this, and how can you use this in your everyday life? So one of the things I wanted to tell you, and one of the, I don't remember if I have no, I don't have another slide on it. One of the things that I said when I was talking to Raluca, I said, I really want to be a hacker like you. And he said, no, man, I'm not a hacker. Hackers know SQL injection. I don't know SQL injection. That was the bar for him, was SQL injection. Like if you knew that, you were real. He was essentially, he considered himself a script kiddie for hire, right? I mean, that's essentially what he considered himself. Now, I don't really like to use that term, script kiddie, because I hear it thrown around by a lot of people who use it in a derogatory way, and they don't have the skill set that the script kiddie that they're deriding has. So I kind of hesitate to use that, but in this case, I think Raluca would be okay with saying he was a script kiddie for hire because he didn't claim to have any skills beyond knowing how to run that tool. So here's what I want you to take away from this. Obviously, use strong passwords. Looking through their password files, mostly their passwords were root123, password123, Beavis. There were some funny ones in there. But they also had kind of crazy passwords like those two that are listed there that I don't know if they found in some dump file somewhere because they just didn't seem to fit the regular mold that they were using. The other thing that was interesting, and when I redid some of this recently, capturing passwords, none of their passwords have a space in them, which I thought was interesting. None of the passwords that I found in their files had spaces in them. So throw a space in, and at least these guys won't be able to get to you. I would also suggest using another port for your SSH. Now again, I'm not suggesting that this is security through obscurity, right? But I'm not really talking about that. I'm just saying it reduces the noise. If you run an SSH server on the internet, these guys hit you, the scanners hit you all the time. Your logs will be full of it. If you move it to another port, it'll cut that noise level down. Because again, if you have good passwords and they're trying against 22, you really don't care, right? Let them try. But if you don't want to let them try, I would suggest fail to ban. And if you haven't checked out fail to ban will actually look at your logs, and when it sees failures in your logs, it can automatically add an IP table rule to block the person who's coming in. And you can configure that so you can say, in case it's you can say, okay, unblock it in 15 minutes, right? Or, never unblock it. I mean, that's kind of up to you. But fail to ban will do a lot to protect you, and it's a pretty good tool. And if you haven't used it, and it's also not just for SSH, I should put that out there. You can also use it for FTP, mail. It can look at those logs and add IP table rules to block stuff on Linux. So I promised my friends back in Charlotte that I would put the plug in for BSides Charlotte. I was one of the organizers of BSides Charlotte and of BSides Pittsburgh, but Charlotte has a BSides coming up June 13th, and it's in conjunction with Southeast Linux Fest, and it's an interesting event because they combined with Southeast Linux Fest, so it's out of the echo chamber, right? They get people who are sysadmins who don't go to security conferences, and they actually show up, and it's a pretty good time. And Southeast Linux Fest is a pretty good time too. Their CFP is open, so if you want to take a spot up here on the podium and give a talk, they'd love to hear from you. And that's all I have to say. So any questions?